Welcome to another installment in the Sight and Sound series. Produced by the Toledo Lucas County Public Library, these interviews are meant to introduce you to some of the most dynamic people in our community. Hello, my name is Meg Delaney. I'm the head of the Humanities Department here at the main library. It's good to be with you today. Joel Lipman is Lucas County's first Poet Laureate. His unique melding of visual art and poetry is interesting, fun, and exciting. Soon after he was appointed by the county commissioners, we began a series of conversations at the library about poetry, our library's collections, initiatives we might develop, and how best to share these ideas with the community. We thought you'd enjoy getting to know Joel. You grew up in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Can you tell us something about your personal background?
Well, Meg, I was born in 1942 in Washington, D.C. at George Washington Hospital. I'm the son of Norman Stanley Abelman and Anna Lee Goldstein. They were high school sweethearts in and around Washington. Of course, 1942 is the commencement of the U.S.'s involvement in World War II. My father joined the Marines and died in battle at Iwo Jima in 1945. So I have really a series of childhood memories and a series of childhood residences, living in Washington until I was 6.5 years old when my mom remarried. She married William Lipman from Wisconsin. And at the age of 7, I moved to Kenosha, Wisconsin, with my mom and my stepfather. I had not been there before. I flew by myself on TWA Airlines to Mitchell Field in Milwaukee, landed, and my mom and my new dad met me. He was driving a Chrysler Woody. And I thought that was a pretty exciting little coupe to start a new phase of my life in. So I grew up in Kenosha from the age of 7, had a wonderful childhood and youth. Went to prep school in Lake Forest, Illinois for 3 years of high school, was in public school in Wisconsin for the rest of the time. And then in 1960, started at the University of Wisconsin as an undergraduate studying English. But,
so what were some of your interests as a child?
Well, I grew up 100 yards from Lake Michigan. Mm-hmm. So I fished and I swam and I beachcombed and I played with my neighborhood friends in a wonderful, unrestrained environment. Kenosha was an industrial town. They made Nash vehicles. They had, at the time, a jockey underwear factory. They had lots and lots of what was still thriving on the cusp of declining industry. Mm-hmm. So it's in many respects the story that those of us that have lived in the north central area of the United States have encountered in our own communities. The factories started to close up or leave. Jockey moved to the south. Simmons mattresses were made there. They left the city. So it was a time of real transition in terms of the industrial economy. I think I was totally buffered from that mm-hmm. as a child. Mm-hmm. I played sports. I was a Boy Scout. I had wonderful friendships, guys and girls. I had a secure home. Mm-hmm. Subsequently, I was joined by a brother and a sister, as my mom had children with her second marriage, and lived in Kenosha until 1960 when I left for Madison.
Wow. So how did you first come to appreciate poetry?
You know, that's a question when we were planning this interview, and I looked at that. I think there was a period where I was interested in what I'd now call pre-poetry. Just good, interesting, effective writing. I wouldn't yet have called it poetry. My stepfather owned and operated a radio station. And so as a teenager, I worked in the radio station with, I guess, the privileged opportunities of being the owner's kid. But it meant that I wrote copy, I pulled news off the wire, I had a restricted operator's license so I could go in and assist the engineer. It was a small station. And I started writing news and sports and I remember writing obituaries, writing the bowling reports because we had a 5-minute report on the bowling leagues at 12:10 every day. And these were very succinct, tight little encapsulations of language. And I liked that. I enjoyed the idea of composing language that had to fill a few seconds of airtime, and that was the stipulation for radio writing at the time. So when I got to college, I was an English major, even though I was studying had a Bachelor of Science undergraduate degree. And there was a great English department at the University of Wisconsin. My interests in general compact prose writing expanded to more literary forms, and gradually things coalesced toward poetry, but there are really several pieces to that. Great mentors, great teachers, and exposure to great pieces of literature.
You have an interesting educational background. I wonder if you could tell us about some of your different degrees.
Well, I have a Bachelor of Science degree with an English major, and many universities probably wouldn't provide the means to get a BS in English, but at the University of Wisconsin at the time, one could so construct their program. And I was interested, again, I think as a result of my youth, in geology and geography and physical science. So I took a wealth of those courses. I studied anthropology, I studied what we called stones and bones. I had a roommate who was in limnology and hydrology, freshwater studies. We talked about those things a lot. But I, at the same time, was an English major. So I read Shakespeare, and I read the great American novelists and poets, and took creative writing courses, while at the same time studying a lot of physical science. It was a fascinating, strong program to have as an undergraduate major. And then I went to law school. People will often inquire as to a kind of an inconsistency with a poet going to law school, but I really don't look at it that way at all. It was a crowning humanities course of study. I rather quickly realized that I didn't intend to be a practicing lawyer, and had the opportunity to start working as a TA. So I kind of made my entry into teaching while I was in law school, working with foreign students and working with people on writing. It seems I began to become a writing instructor while I was in law school. Took that degree, joined the bar, though I never did practice, and then went on to further graduate study, first in mass communications at the University of Wisconsin, and then subsequently at the State University of New York at Buffalo, where I took a master's in creative writing.
So at what point did the visual and spatial elements of your work begin to emerge?
There was a poet, and I would be remiss to not mention the name of D.A. Levy. Darrell Levy was a Cleveland poet who died as a suicide in 1968. But those were, the 60s at the University of Wisconsin were certainly tumultuous times. They were times of student protest. D.A. Levy, as a young Midwestern poet, came to the University of Wisconsin as the Free University's Poet in Residence. And what the Free University was an alternative educational structure that coexisted for a number of years during the 60s when politics created alternative structures in so many ways. Levy was a printer, had his own little letterpress, had been trained briefly as a studio artist, and was interested in graphic and visual presentation of language. And he was also a young, but clearly a master poet in a lexical, conventional way. His work captivated me. He was kind of my age, there were similarities, and I don't think I ever really saw the reason for a distinction between lexical poetry and visual poetry. To me, they were both manifestations of poetic thinking that were creatively interesting to investigate and kind of beautiful to look at once you had finished the composition.
Are there other strong influences on you?
Well, the poet Kenneth Patchen from the Warren, Ohio area originally, similarly a poet who explored both visual texts and lexical texts. But Kenneth Patchen's work was marvelously exciting to interest, and I'm not by any means alone in being inspired by Patchen. I had great teachers once I began to study poetry. I studied with the Library of Congress poet and the Poet Laureate of the state of Illinois, Gwendolyn Brooks. She was a mentor to many young writers, African American poets and obviously white poets as well. She opened doors for many of us, including myself. At the University of Buffalo, I studied with the great Ohio poet James Wright, and indeed I would count some of Wright's poems among the most memorable poems in my own experience. I studied with the minimalist Black Mountain poet Robert Creeley as well, and by the time I had my degrees, I had a lot of exposure to master poets who spanned about 30 or 40 years of significant mid-century work in American letters.
So then what brought you to Toledo?
Well, one does go to work. I was offered a job by the University of Toledo in 1975. I'd worked in Chicago for a few years at Columbia College, a small arts school at the time that has now grown to a pretty significant public arts college. But as I finished my master's in creative writing at Buffalo, I put myself on the market, and I had an offer from Toledo, and it felt like a good fit. And I came here, and I have been very happy.
Well, as you said, growing up not far from Lake Michigan, so now you're just continuing your Great Lakes journey.
I often thought I should do this whole thing by a boat. You know, we should put in Kenosha and go down to Chicago and somehow portage over to Madison for a few years.
That would be great.
Back to Buffalo and off to Toledo.
So how do you think regionalism figures into your view as a poet?
Well, regionalism, I think for a writer, is both a little bit of a trap and a huge opportunity. And I hope that I've been able to explore and develop my interest in regionalism opportunistically. Chicago, living there, teaching my first poetry workshops in that city, Chicago has a strong sense of itself as a regional city, as a second city, as a dynamic city, and of course a city that has a great tradition in poetry. So during those years, I wrote a lot of poems. I wrote poems about the city of Chicago, about the highways, about the people, about the neighborhoods, My friends, my literary friends, were as well poets, men, women, Hispanic, African American, white. I mean, we represented a huge spectrum of the country, but we all lived in Chicago, and we were all writing about Chicago and starting our first editorships and starting our first little independent presses and teaching classes. It formed community. Community was very important, I think, to those of us who had our formative years in the 60s. And so writing about your locality was what we did. And in a way, we were trying to create a counter canon to the universals that were represented by more academic approaches to poetry. And I just really never drifted very far from those concerns. I went back to Wisconsin for a few years. I did some editorship for a regional newspaper, worked as poetry editor for the Ocoee Mountain News, and that was a very regional focused, back to the land publication. The general editor was a wonderful woman by the name of Emily Osborne, who continues to live and work in Wisconsin. And when I came to Toledo, I brought some of those ideas of regional publications and trying to serve a regional community with me to the university, and have always tried to maintain that aspect of my focus as a writer.
So one of the interesting things to me in looking at your work, and we have a retrospective of your work in the library right now, is the idea of mail art. And is mail art considered part of the counter canon? And how did you get interested in that?
Well, first, for viewers of this program, let's spell it out.
Okay.
It's M-A-I-L.
Thank you.
So we're not talking about a gender-defined kind of art. We're talking about postal art, correspondence art, and obviously mail art. All the same thing, but I offer those words just so there's no confusion here. Mail art developed in the mid and late 1950s as a manifestation of conceptual art. It was a way of taking an idea and creating art to expand on a given idea. And some of the other things that are part of conceptual art, just to kind of create the larger environment, were happenings, were performance art, were unplanned, spontaneous art actions, were appropriative art, where you would simply find something interesting and sort of add your marks to it and represent it as its own unique work of art. So the idea of using the postal system and fashioning artworks that could both move through the international postal system, break through those boundaries of censorship that existed globally. I mean, we're still very much in the Cold War during the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, the heyday of mail art. Gave me an opportunity to be politically engaged, to have an international world of correspondence, and to exhibit in many different countries, because mail art exhibitions were part of the mail art culture. To employ the kind of marking devices that I was increasingly interested in, rubber stamps and ditto machines and different kinds of surfaces that would carry letters and ultimately create visual poems. So mail art was and continues to be a fascinating part of my practice, though of course email and other digital transmission systems have replaced a lot of our reliance on what we now call snail mail, but which I would prefer to call postal mail.
Did the poemvelope, and we might need to spell that out too,
Yes.
did that grow out of this?
Yes, poemvelope Poemvelope, and I would always stamp it with a capital M and lowercase surrounding letters, was my coinage, my term for an envelope with a poem stamped on it, sometimes stamped inside of it as well. And it created a wrapper, it created a kind of a cover for a document, which could then, of course, as a letter, be folded and placed inside the envelope, the poem-velope. And I began to really develop the concept. And again, reaching back to the idea that mail art is a conceptual art action. The concept of a letter around a letter, of sending things unannounced as a gift to other people, because one of the criteria for mail art is that you relinquish what you send. It's a correspondence, it's a co-respondence, so you expect your respondent to communicate in kind back to you. Very active, engaged system.
So when did the Toledo Poets Center develop?
The Toledo Poets Center was a community literary organization that Nick Muska and I formed in 1977. Nick is a poet, a wonderful poet and a close friend of mine, who had also just moved to Toledo about the same time that I came here. He had been an assistant professor at Wabash College in Indiana. And we had a similar grounding and similar interests as poets. We were both young. We didn't want to isolate ourselves from the larger poetry community. We wrote a grant to the Ohio Arts Council, gained some funding, and launched the Toledo Poets Center, which sponsored well over 150 poets for about 20 years, which sponsored 2 or 3 generations of independent poetry publication. It was an opportunity to engage the community in literary activities, to encourage folks who, quote, wanted to do something as poets to get involved. Joan Wernert, a woman, opened the Colony Bookstore, which for about 10 years was a poetry bookstore at the corner of Monroe and Central Avenue. Other people picked up the idea and started little presses. But we brought in poets from A to Z, and by that I mean from John Ashbery to Richard Brautigan and Gwendolyn Brooks and Allen Ginsberg, right down to Christine Zawadzki. And sponsored readings. My commitment was always to not be an ivory tower academic poet, so our sponsorships would always have a community piece and a campus piece. And we would invite poets in for 2 days, 1 day of which they would meet on campus, maybe with students, or maybe give a reading on campus, and the other day they would meet with community writers or give a reading at a club or a bar or a coffee shop or a library, someplace that was off campus. And it was a successful program. We won quite a number of awards for community service and for community impact. And I think we did have an impact on elevating the poetry profile for the region. And of course there are a great many poets that live in and around Toledo, and I hope a few of them can attribute their interest to the work we did at the Toledo Poets Center.
Well, that makes me think of, why you would be perfectly poised to be the Poet Laureate, and how does that vision of the center carry forward into what you think a Poet Laureate should do, and how you see this evolving in the community?
Well, when the county commissioners developed the position in, I guess it was December of 2007, and the appointment was made in January of 2008. I was honored, pleased, a little bit intimidated by being nominated for that first poet laureateship for Lucas County. But I had studied with a poet laureate, and the idea of the kind of programming that laureates might develop within their communities was something I'd thought about. I mean, and not at all with respect to being a laureate, because that wasn't the game plan, but my teachers had just impressed me with their community dedication. So when that appointment was made, and when our preliminary conversations kind of pointed toward a connection with the library, it was a perfect fit, because prior to the National Poet Laureate position being developed, there was a poet who was a consultant to the Library of Congress, and that poet acted in a kind of quasi-poet laureate capacity, guiding the collection development in a way, creating higher visibility for poetry within the communities, encouraging national programs periodically, of course writing the occasional poem on this or that occasion, hopefully only doing that infrequently, but nonetheless being the voice that would speak a poem on a handful of suitable occasions. So bringing that concept to Lucas County was, to me, just a great opportunity, and of course I've tried, with the real input of the library and you and your colleagues, to launch a few programs that hopefully will survive well beyond my own 2-year appointment as laureate.
So you think we can continue some of those cornerstone center projects?
Well, we've had 2 exhibitions so far. We've had an exhibition of mail art, which I think was interesting for the community and rather widely viewed. We now have a retrospective of my own work down there, and over the next year or so we plan 2 more. One indeed to catalog the history of the Toledo Poets Center, and one to gather artists' books and to explore that area of poetic practice where the book arts and literary arts converge. Of course, I would hope that subsequent laureates would continue to exhibit in ways that reflect their interests and their expertise. We're talking about commencing an online anthology, which I think will create a magnificent archive of the work of writers from around the Toledo, Lucas County area. I would certainly hope that that would be an ongoing project that would develop over time and become a real snapshot of early 21st century writing in Northwest Ohio. We talk about, in fact, I guess we're just about ready to launch Picturing America, which brings together the Toledo Museum of Art and, of course, the library system and its branches, and my energies as laureate, and looks at great iconic works of American art and encourages students to reflect about them, to write about them, to compose their own stories and poems based on these magnificent and important artworks. So, we've got things going, and we'll just continue to add more to it as our resources and times allow.
That's great. Are there some writers that you think members of the community should be more aware of?
The writer Bob Phillips has a new little chapbook coming out. Bob Phillips is a Toledo native, wonderful poet, and if you were to ask many people who is our real poet laureate, they would probably say Bob Phillips. He's been writing since youth, and is the real deal. Nick Muska, I mentioned already, wonderful poet. His new book, All Cool, has just been published by the Urban Affairs Center Press, which I'm a co-editor of. Lynn Walker is another poet in the city whose collection has been published by the Urban Affairs Center Press. John Dorsey and Michael Grover both are residents of the Collingwood Arts Center. They sponsor poetry readings, and Michael has started an independent press. My son Joel Lipman has just returned to Toledo after 10 years in Honolulu, and is a wonderful poet who I hope people around the community will get to know as well. I'm sure I've left writers out. I'd be remiss to not mention my colleagues at the University of Toledo, the fine poet Rain Arroyo, the wonderful poet and printer Tim Geiger, and though I'm dipping into prose, I'll just mention Jane Bradley, a marvelous prose writer and professor at the University of Toledo.
That's a wonderful
We've
list.
got so many writers in the community. You know, and I haven't mentioned the writers who write for youthful audiences, for adolescent audiences, who are genre writers. I mean, it's a place where you can live and support yourself, and of course in a digital age you don't have to live down the street from your publisher anymore.
Right. Now, speaking of editing, you edit a number of publications, you work with different writers. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I think being a mature, involved writer means that you braid together several different facets of your expertise. Yes, I edit and have served as a publisher for independent presses for now over 25 years. Different press projects, they come and go, but we get the books out, we publish community writers, we provide an opportunity with those kinds of publications for first books, which are launching pads for singers and songwriters and writers who go on to commercial success, and we could count among our initial publications those of writers who indeed have gone on to real success in the arts. One sponsors other writers and plans their readings so that you bring new and vital voices into your community, so that you're not just kind of listening to yourself or yourselves, so bringing in a schedule of writers for readings in the way the Toledo Poets Center has done is another thread that you braid together. Of course, you do your own writing, your own, in my case, visual and lexical work as a poet, and keep active publishing in that regard, both within your regional community but beyond that as well. I don't think that being a poet means that you just sit at a desk in front of a window and look out and contemplate nature and write about it, which isn't to say we don't do that from time to time, but it's an engagement with your community, an engagement with your world, an engagement with its problems, whether they're economic or emotional.
Well, that makes me want to go in two directions. First of all, if we were to visit your studio, what would we see? What are you working on right now?
I'm working on a series of visual poems that indeed have their origins in the letters of Norman Mailer, which were recently published. A lengthy sampling of those letters was published in the New Yorker magazine. And Mailer was always a writer that I'd read and found important and significant. So in the manner of one phase of my work, I found little phrases within Mailer's letters that interested me as language. I took those words, recomposed them, redeveloped them, printed them using rubber stamps and other devices on different papers, and I'm in the midst of a project that will probably result in either gallery exhibition or publication of those letters, which I'm referring to at least as a working title of Appropriations from Norman Mailer. Appropriation is something that does interest me. I mean, we hear, we see, we read things of other writers. It has an impact on us. Somehow it works its way into our own thinking. So I've tried to be very upfront about the fact that I gain inspiration from other writers' work. So you'd see those works in progress. I'm working on a collection of poems, more or less conventional poems, called Homage to Man Ray, the surrealist photographer. And that's a book of at this point of about 25 or 30 poems that are inspired by surrealism, that are I guess essentially love poems or poems of sensual and erotic experience. So you'd see that on the computer end of my studio being assembled right now. And then sadly, you'd also see a lot of boxes from the shows that we're taking up and putting down at the library. I haven't had time to cart all that stuff up to the attic yet, so there's a bit of clutter to walk around.
That's great. Well, and I just think it's interesting that you have a studio,
yeah,
and not just a desk.
Filled with rubber stamps, filled with type, filled with inks, filled with all kinds of different papers. I have 2 drafting tables, as well as obviously a computer station and some other workstations. It is, I think probably most artists view their studios as intimate places that reflect the nuances and subtleties of their own creative work, and certainly mine has adapted to my practices.
Great. I'm also interested in the community engagement piece, not only with poetry, but just in the rest of your life, and the ways in which you have engaged with the community.
Well, if I could define my work as a professor entirely, it would be as a public scholar. It would be as someone whose focus is his community and bringing what I know and the merit of that instruction to as broad a population as possible. Now that defines, in a way, a vision, an ideal, because we all know that we have to bring in tuition students to pay the bills, and one has classes, and I love teaching at a public university because, in a way, it is the community that you're teaching. It's not an elite group. It's not a group that has an economic divide from the general population. So, I mean, I didn't join the faculty at the University of Toledo without real awareness of the fact that it was a regional, at the time primarily commuter university, even though that's changed a bit over the years. So yes, I am interested in having an impact on my community. As a poet, I want my ideas, my sense of priorities, my vision, concept of the word, to at least be part of the larger dialogue. And so I am involved in community initiatives to the degree that my time and energies and expertise allow. Most significantly in the past few years, it was the Walk Westgate initiative, which I did play a role in, and we had hoped to create a more pedestrian and bicycle-friendly environment in that busy commercial corner of the city. Whether we succeeded or not, with the renovated Westgate and the changes that occurred once the old shopping center was torn down and the new one was built, and I'll leave that to others to decide. But we certainly learned a lot, and a great many people became involved in the idea of neighborhood planning that previously had not been.
You know, a frequent question that comes up in libraries when we're talking with readers and talking with writers is, do you have a favorite book? Is there a book that's been particularly influential or just holds your imagination over time?
That's such a hard question, because I live in a house that, if it weren't constructed of concrete blocks, could probably be constructed of bound books. So I have loads of books that I fear not being able to sort of actually see around me as I walk through my house. I tend to read poetry a lot, but I think if I had a favorite book, it would be a strange little utopian novel by the English writer Herbert Reed, Sir Herbert Reed, called The Green Child. And The Green Child is a curious political fable about returning to your childhood and going to a particular place where the river is now flowing in the opposite direction, and all kinds of marvelous, transcendent events occur. And it's a beautifully written book. It was a book that I read at a critical time in my own growth as a literary person, and that I return to and periodically reread. Love it. Sir Herbert Reed's The Green Child.
Great. I also wonder if you would mind sharing a couple favorite poems with us.
I would love to. Let me read a poem by James Wright, great Ohio poet and one of my teachers, and then let me read a poem by Dave Etter, an Illinois poet who's not quite as well known around here. Twilights. The big stones of the cistern behind the barn are soaked in whitewash. My grandmother's face is a small maple leaf pressed in a secret box. Locusts are climbing down into the dark green crevices of my childhood. Latches click softly in the trees. Your hair is gray. The arbors of cities are withered, far off. The shopping centers empty and darken, a red shadow of steel mills. And that's James Wright's poem, Twilights.
Thank you.
Can I read a second?
Please.
Dave Etter lives in Elmore, Illinois, a small town in downstate Illinois. Of course, downstate in Illinois means anything outside of Chicago. And this is from his book, How High the Moon, poems inspired by jazz tunes. Gardenia. Brought her a little white gardenia. She pinned it on her blue dress. Her mother stared at her, stared at me. Her father stared at her, stared at me. We're going now, my girl said. We're going now, I said. Had my dad's Ford out front, helped her in, closed the door. Off to the dance, I said. Going, 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 she said. She sat close to me, sat real close to me. Thanks for the lovely flowers, she said. It sure looks nice, I said. We drove down Prairie Street. We drove down Illinois Street. Going, 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 she said. Moon burned red above the courthouse dome. Stores slept with their night lights on. Freight train rumbled its cars into dark fields. Parked the Ford outside the high school gym. Went in by the back door holding hands. Band was playing Green Eyes. Band was playing Skylark. She stared at me, I stared at her. She kissed me on the lips. Then we kissed on the lips. Band was playing At Last. We danced slowly. We danced barely moving. She put her head on my chest. Gardenia smelled like spring in Eden. Never felt quite like this, she said. Going, going, gone, I said. Going, going, gone, she said.
Thank you. You've been involved in several kind of alternative press publications, and I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about Bagzine and 11 by 30 and Sleaze Art News.
Well, Bagazine and the Sleaze Art News were really concept publications, prototypes, more than truly typical publications. They gave me a chance to explore ideas more than to actually fabricate a publication in the more conventional sense. Bagazine explored the idea of the bag. When I was involved in mail art, I had taken a trip to a envelope factory because I wanted to see the production of envelopes. And it was a wonderful, insightful visit, and I found out that a certain kind of envelope was known in the trade as a bag. And it was a certain kind of die-cut envelope. And so the idea of using the word bag became an obsession with me. So it was in a way an extension of my interest in the poemvelope to create a publication that used an envelope as a wrapper, a bag, and to fill it with other kinds of materials. The Sleaze Art News was similar. I picked up a little portable ditto machine, one of those wonderful fluid-based contraptions that you cranked around, and for years I just enjoyed using it. Now, if you'll remember dittos, they were ephemeral. If you left the paper out in the exposed to light, in a day or two it had faded to nothing. And I loved the idea of ephemerality. I liked the idea of something being very short-lived. So I would print things using my ditto machine. I would send them off knowing that the recipient of the Sleaze Art News would have a document that was going to fade rather quickly and disappear before his or her eyes. 11 by 30 was a more sophisticated, indeed professionally published broadside. 11 by 30 defines its dimensions. It was 11 inches wide and 30 inches long. It had a pinhole in the top so that you could hang it and neatly display it. It was a calendar for upcoming Toledo Poets Center readings, as well as a good-looking, well-printed, on attractive paper stock publication, and the people who received it valued it, and the collections that kept it wrote me for a number of years, even after I stopped doing it, saying, when's the next issue of 11 by 30 coming out? And the answer was, sadly, never. But again, part of my practice as an independent publisher, I've had really a lot of different press projects over the years, those several, and the Toledo Poets Center Press, the Radio Room Press, and now the Urban Affairs Center Press.
Another poet who seems to have figured largely in your work is Byrne Porter, and I wonder if you could share with the audience a little bit about Byrne.
Byrne Porter was from Porter Colony, Maine, was born there, and was a man who was trained as a physicist, took a master's degree at Brown University in Rhode Island after an undergraduate degree at Colby College in Maine. Bernard Porter, known as Byrne, went on to work on the Manhattan Project, which of course developed the atomic bomb, worked on the development of the cathode ray tube for television, worked on the staff of the Saturn rocket. So he was an active physicist, but he was also an eccentric gadfly, a poet, a photographer, a bookmaker, and a publisher. And he had these two, I think in many ways, converging and rather disparate interests, a scientist and a literary man. He was also an urban planner. He wrote a town plan for Rockport, Maine, that was so extensive that it was simply shelved and never followed because it totally changed the concept of this coastal Maine community. So he had interests that were in some respects not unlike my own, though he lived at a different time and place. His work as a found poet, as a poet who would take documents that were out there in the publishing landscape and convert them to work of his own, had an affinity to my own interests, a kind of post-Duchampian acquisitiveness of taking commercial objects and recreating them as art objects. So I met Bern. I sponsored Bern on 2 occasions when I was running the Toledo Poets Center. He came to Toledo with a friend of his, Mark Melnikov, who is now his estate's literary executor. And I hope that one of my publications before I get done with this interesting phase of my life will be a book on Bern Porter, and certainly that is my objective as I'm studying his work in various archives and special collections.
Mm-hmm. You know, one of the interesting projects that we've been able to collaborate on is the Wednesday Poetry Conversations, when you are here at the library and available to anyone to come and talk about their poetry, their writing.
You know, when we first started to plan my activities as Poet Laureate, I didn't know how that would work out. Just having open public office hours for a couple of hours, several hours Wednesdays. But it really has grown over these months to where now 3, 4, 5 people sometimes a day are waiting to discuss poetry, bringing in their manuscripts ranging from poems of personal motivation, poems of faith, poems of politics, to you know, what we might call a more advanced and sophisticated kind of poetry that investigates concepts, things, nature, other kinds of questions. It's been wonderful. I mean, I have met community poets of all ages, of all backgrounds, of all levels of expertise, and hopefully we've, you know, elevated again the literary denominators of the community a little bit through those conversations. I love them. It's the high point of my week to come down and to meet with community writers Wednesday afternoons.
What are some of your other objectives? What can we look forward to in the future?
I have, as a publishing poet, been far more dedicated to periodical publication than to good, solid, big books. And I guess at this point, the good, solid, big book is very much on my mind. So I'm putting together several smaller books right now, but I would hope to gather a comprehensive selected or collected poems over the next few years. And again, one of those stacks in my studio right now is the preliminary phase of that project. So I would hope to have a couple of good, solid publications developed over the next few years. And I want to help my son Jesse launch his new coffee shop and poetry venue. So I hope to stay involved in a family-oriented business venture, which is something that since leaving Kenosha has not been part of the mix of my activities, and I'm excited about that.
That's great.
My wife is finishing her master's degree in nursing, so she'll be working in some context as a nurse, which she has been doing for a number of years, and go on and raise my family.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned your son Jesse. I wonder if you could tell us about the rest of your family.
Of course. My wife is the former Cynthia Landrum of Perrysburg. So we've been married for 26 years. We have 2 children of our own. Samantha, who is a designer and works in Toledo, has a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree from the University of Texas, and my youngest son, Eli, is an aspiring glass artist who is studying scientific glass technology as an undergraduate in New Jersey, and learned his glass art at the Toledo Museum of Art, as of course so many Toledoans have. Mm-hmm. And along with Jesse and his wife Christina and their children, that's my family.
Mm-hmm. Well, I've really enjoyed this opportunity to speak with you and really appreciate your time.
Great to have a chance to talk to you, Meg.
Thanks. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to view this episode of Sights and Sounds. Stay tuned next time when we speak with Jean Holden.